Michelson designed a new instrument that was exquisitely precise. It was called an interferometer. Shown here using a laser, a Michelson interferometer begins by splitting a beam of light into two beams. A partially transparent and partially reflecting mirror sends two beams traveling on perpendicular paths. Each is reflected back to the point where they had been split in two. There, they combine into a single beam again. Michelson's interferometer can be seen as a race between two light beams. If the race ends in a tie, the result is a bright spot at the center of the interference pattern.
This blue box that you see fires a laser or a coherent light source. This diagonal line is a mirror that splits the beam into two paths. Right? Now, if the device itself isn't moving, as the beams of light go around the circuit, they recombine. Right? And because, c, the speed of light, is constant, they're going to take the same amount of time to go around this path either way, and they're going to recombine, and there's going to be no interference. Right? There's going to be no deconstructive interference of any kind. Which would indicate that the device itself is stationary. However, if the device itself is moving, what that does is physically change the distance that one of the beams of light has to travel. In this case, because it's going clockwise, the red beam of light has had to travel a shorter path because the gyroscope is moving underneath the movement of the light, which means that the red path has been shorter. And what that measures as is an interference pattern in the light wave. So as the red light goes in, you get one waveform, and then as the blue one goes in, you get another waveform. And because they're not synced, that measures as an interference pattern, right? And you only get that interference pattern if the entire thing is moving. That's the only way that would happen. It can't measure outside. It doesn't know what's going on. The only way that you will measure an interference pattern in the recombination of the light is if the entire gyroscope is moving, which we put it on was actually moving. Now, if the Earth was stationary, then as my display showed, the interference pattern would be practically non-existent. Well, because it's not moving. The interference pattern would be practically non-existent. Well, because it's not moving. As they recombine, there's going to be no interference, and it's not going to register as a drift.
Albert Michelson, in his experiment, had set out to detect the absolute motion of the Earth. In his days, he never fully accepted the implications of his famous experiment.
Now let me tell you what the facts were. One is that Michelson, of course, never for the rest of his life believed the results of his own experiment.
He never denied the results.
Wait, how is that?
He did not deny the results. He went to his deathbed
Yeah, he
saying,
did.
I still don't...
He died, he denied.
No, he never denied the results. The results was a null result.
Every
He
didn't deny the result.
No, Brian, shut up. He didn't deny it.
Denying the results of the experiment, bro.
No, you're wrong. He didn't deny it.
This is confirmed by the fact that Michelson did another experiment in 1925 in order to measure the ether movement for the daily rotation between space and Earth. In that experiment, he found 6/6 of the required ether for a daily rotation. Hence, it is logical to assume that the 1/6 he found in 1887 came from the same ether he later detected in his 1925 experiment.
Of the Michelson Gale, a less popular experiment, many years later, like 20. This is like
it got the same. It got the same results, but much more accurate.
No, they measured 95% of the measurement for the ether.
No, they didn't.
Yeah, they did. Okay,
no,
then
they
why?
didn't.
How? Okay,
no,
then
why?
They didn't.
No, they measured within 95% accuracy that the ether didn't exist. No, and
according to Michelson, the first beam traveled only about 1/6 of the speed it needed if the Earth was moving around the Sun. The conclusion, as Michelson notes above, should have been that the Earth isn't moving around the Sun. The conclusion, as Michelson notes above, should have been that the Earth isn't moving around the Sun. The conclusion, as Michelson notes above, should have been that the Earth isn't moving around the Sun. Other prominent physicists have noted the same truth. There was just one alternative. The Earth's true velocity through space might happen to have been nil.
Until the day he died, he was trying to test the motion of the Earth. He was trying to prove or disprove the motion of the Earth in space.
No.
In my opinion.
Okay, right. So
But yeah,
the Michelson-Morley experiment, right, was to detect the absolute motion of the Earth in relation to the ether. Okay, they knew that the Earth moved.
And there's the trick, folks. By claiming that we already know the Earth is in motion, then that throws off the whole purpose of Michelson's test. He says, more than once, and it's, that he's trying to measure the Earth's absolute motion. Craig says that he's trying to measure the absolute motion relative to the ether. So what is absolute motion? It's a motion that does not depend on anything external to the moving object for its existence or specific nature. So that's exactly opposite to relative motion. Absolute motion is opposite of relative motion. So Craig is wrong, as usual. Now, when I first seen his version of Bob's ring laser gyro test, I about laughed out of my seat. He is describing the Michelson-Morley interferometer down to a T. And he doesn't even understand that, so I really hope he sees this video. The interferometer and the ring laser gyro, as well as the fiber optic gyro, are they're pretty much the same thing. They have no moving parts. They measure the interference of the combined light beam. They split it in different paths and then recombine it. And as Craig said, if there is no interference, then there is no motion. The device is not moving. So he's backing up the Michelson-Morley 100%. So years later, Michelson makes a few changes and does another experiment and reorients his device and measures a 15-degree rotation. So with the same device, he measures a 15-degree rotation, but fails to measure the Earth's motion around the sun. So wouldn't it follow that the Earth is not moving around the sun? The 15-degree rotation, therefore, is in the light around us. The stars, the sun, they call it the ether, whatever call it what you want. But that's what's moving. I think he proved it. So from them making the claim we already know the Earth is in motion, allowed them to put a twist on the experiment. And to explain that, to make it match all the known physics, it took them almost a decade. And they had to do absurd things like claim that the arm of the apparatus, only one of them, shrank. And a consequence of that, they had to dilate time. And then they had to dilate mass. It's not science. I think it's obvious.
Arthur Eddington. The data of the Michelson-Morley test were almost unbelievable. There was only one other possible conclusion to draw, that the Earth was at rest. Bernard Jaffe. Thus, failure of the Michelson-Morley experiment to observe different speeds of light at different times of the year suggested that the Earth must be at rest, and it was therefore the preferred frame for measuring absolute motion in space. Yet we have known since Galileo that the Earth is not the center of the universe. Why should it be at rest in space? Adolf Baker. The easiest explanation was that the Earth was fixed in the ether and that everything else in the universe moved with respect to the Earth in the ether. Such an idea was not considered seriously, since it would mean, in effect, that our Earth occupied the omnipotent position in the universe, with all the other heavenly bodies paying homage by moving around it. James Coleman. The Michelson-Morley experiment confronted scientists with an embarrassing alternative. On one hand, they could scrap the ether theory, which had explained so many things about electricity, magnetism, and light, or if they insisted on retaining the ether, they had to abandon the still more venerable Copernican theory that the Earth is in motion. To many physicists, it seemed almost easier to believe that the Earth stood still than that waves, light waves, electromagnetic waves, could exist without a medium to sustain them. It was a serious dilemma, and one that split scientific thought for a quarter of a century. Many new hypotheses were advanced and rejected. The experiment was tried again by Morley and by others, with the same conclusion. The apparent velocity of the Earth through the ether was zero. Lincoln Barnett, forward by Albert Einstein. What happened when the experiment was done in 1887? There was never in any orientation at any time of the year, any shift in the interference pattern. None. No shift, no fringe shift, nothing. What's the implication? Here was an experiment that was done to measure the speed of the Earth's motion through the ether. This was an experiment that was 10 times more sensitive than it needed to be. It could have detected speeds as low as 2 miles per second instead of the known 20 miles per second that the Earth moves on its orbital motion around the sun. It didn't detect it. What's the conclusion from the Michelson-Morley experiment? The implication is that the Earth is not moving. Richard Wolfson. Michelson and Morley found shifts in the interference fringes, but they were very much smaller than the size of the effect expected from the known orbital motion of the Earth. John D. Norton. This null result was one of the greatest puzzles of physics at the end of the 19th century. One possibility was that velocity would be zero and no fringe shift would be expected, but this implies that the Earth is somehow a preferred object. Only with respect to the Earth would the speed of light be c as predicted by Maxwell's equations. This is tantamount to assuming that the Earth is the central body of the universe. Douglas C. Giancoldi. But the diehard Copernicans of that day were not about to accept the prima facie results of Michelson's experiment. They knew the catastrophic scientific, cultural, and religious implications if it was experimentally shown that the Earth is fixed in space. In a word, the whole world would have been turned upside down, literally and figuratively. Pressured to provide a scientific answer to the world, they searched for a way to make it appear that the first light beam did indeed provide sixth of the speed required for an Earth moving around the sun. To do so, they thought up an ingenious but devious explanation. As noted above, they claimed the Earth's movement around the sun contracted the metal enclosure in which the first light beam traveled. If the length of the housing was contracted, then the first light beam does not need to travel as far as when the housing is not contracted. This would account for why the speed of the two light beams did not differ much. With this contrived explanation, they proposed to the world that the contraction of Michelson's apparatus was the reason the Earth appeared to be motionless. In effect, if someone said to them, "You claim the Earth is moving, but you admit you cannot detect that movement by any experiment," they would retort, "Well, we can't detect it because every time we try to do so, the length of the experimental apparatus shrinks just enough to conceal the movement, which makes it impossible to measure the Earth's movement." Again, we see the fallacy of petitio principii in play. From start to finish, the whole enterprise was ad hoc. Length contraction wasn't even contemplated previously, much less was it an established fact of science. But in this emergency situation, length contraction was invented on the spot so that the science establishment would have at least some hypothetical answer as to why Michelson's experiment showed the Earth was motionless. Everyone could breathe a sigh of relief. The irony, as of this date, is that no one has ever detected a length contraction in a moving object. In fact, modern physicists can't even agree on what length contraction is or how it would be manifested. Since they insist the Earth is moving around the sun, yet cannot detect it moving, nevertheless, they needed some physical and mathematical way of accounting for it, since there's obviously a difference between motion and non-motion. So length contraction became their convenient scapegoat. This is the essence of the special relativity theory that Einstein invented in 1905. It was invented solely to answer Michelson's experiment, as Einstein himself said. To the question whether or not the motion of the Earth in space can be made perceptible in terrestrial experiments, we have already remarked that all attempts of this nature led to a negative result. Before the theory of relativity was put forward, it was difficult to become reconciled by this negative result. Whereas in 1892, Hendrik Lorentz had hypothesized that the ether of space was what caused the contraction, Einstein decided to dispense with ether and attribute the cause to relative motion. In effect, Lorentz at least proposed a physical cause for his claims of length contraction, but Einstein never explained how relative motion could shrink objects. Hence, during his day, various philosophers accused him of violating the principle of cause and effect. So whatever the cause of the contraction, in order to give the ad hoc theory some semblance of credibility, the required amount for the metal enclosure to contract was put into a mathematical equation called the Lorenz Transform. It has become the most famous and most used equation in modern physics. Essentially, whatever tests disagree with their belief that the Earth was moving around the sun could now be mathematically transformed into their desired result, as well as give the semblance of being scientific. But the transform of length required another transform. Since they contracted the length, they also had to dilate the time, since if a moving object has its length contracted, it is not going to get from point A to point B in the same time as when it is not contracted. To increase the time of travel, they use the same transform equation as above, but since they are increasing instead of decreasing, they turn the multiplier into a divider to get the following equation. Of course, just as there is no proof that length contracts, there is no proof that time dilates. They just need it to make everything appear to balance if they are going to insist that the Earth is moving around the sun when the empirical evidence says that it's not. It's easy for them. They just put up a theory and represent it by a mathematical equation to erase any discrepancies the experiment shows against their theory. The transforms are not over. They must also add mass increase, since if a moving object has its length contracted, then it will have a larger mass per unit volume when it gets to point B. So to make the mass larger, they use the same exact transform equation as for time dilation.